I'll start this episode with a very cautious phrase. It seems that the rhetoric in the White House has finally changed, and the White House is ready to put pressure on the dictator Putin, impose sanctions, and increase military aid to Ukraine. After today's statement by Donald Trump that if it weren't for him, not Donald Trump, very bad things would have already happened to Russia. The White House has begun to announce that the United States, and in particular Donald Trump, is seriously considering lifting all restrictions on Ukraine that were imposed during Joseph Biden's time. And all this concerns the conduct of military operations by the armed forces of Ukraine. What is meant are these restrictions on the use of long-range weapons and so on and so on. So Trump has decided to lift these restrictions. On the other hand, today it is being reported that Trump is actually ready to impose sanctions against Russia, possibly even as early as this week. At the same time, if this last push doesn't work, Trump is considering the possibility of abandoning peaceful negotiations. And here we have an interesting signal. Today, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham published a message to Moscow and stated that his bill on draconian sanctions against Moscow and its allies already has 82 co-authors. That is, 82 senators of the United States Congress are ready to support this bill. Moreover, this means that even if Trump changes his mind and decides to veto it, he won't be able to do so. Nevertheless, in Trump's team, they continue to bet on peaceful negotiations. And today, Kit Kellogg named a possible location for peace talks with Putin and Zelensky. So let's discuss this whole topic together, because this marks a very important shift in the rhetoric of both Trump and the White House. And maybe we really want to believe in this. In the last 2 days, he hasn't just been criticizing Putin for no reason. My name is Alex Ipeci. Let's go over everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave your comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peci News. It's called Peci News, and the link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as soon as it comes in. So now let's go over everything step by step. So today, as you know, Donald Trump wrote such an honest post saying that if it weren't for him, Russia would have already faced some very, very bad things. But in reality, he is saving the dictator Putin and says that Putin is playing with fire. And after that, Kyiv Post comes out with a piece saying that Trump is seriously considering lifting all restrictions for Ukraine that were imposed during Biden's time. And yesterday, let me remind you, it was the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, who announced the lifting of restrictions, and now his envoy is flying to Washington to meet with Trump's team. But let's go step by step, so we don't get ahead of ourselves. The United States has not yet lifted all the restrictions imposed during the presidency of Joe Biden regarding Ukraine's conduct of military operations. However, Trump is seriously considering such a possibility. High-ranking Western officials are talking about this. And next, I'll quote Kyiv Post. All previously imposed restrictions, regardless of whether they have already been eased or not, are currently being reviewed. Since Trump believes that the current status quo does not serve our common interests in the matter of pressuring Russia to negotiate, one of the Western officials told the publication that Trump's final decision regarding pressure on Russia, as well as the next stage of support for Ukraine, will be discussed at meetings with German officials in Washington this week. According to the source, German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul is planning to arrive in the United States capital in the coming days. Wadephul noted that Europe is already preparing a new 18th package of sanctions, and as he stated, the West's response will follow, I think, also from the United States of America. And here's what happens next. The specialist on Russia and Ukraine, Jorge Rivero, states that the possible easing of Western restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range weaponry represents a shift in the operational and strategic situation of the war. Quote, "The easing of restrictions may allow Kyiv to strike military targets on Russian territory, including air bases from which Dirain 2 drones and strategic bombers carrying out massive strikes on Ukrainian cities are launched. After all, previous Western restrictions on the use of high-tech weaponry had effectively protected key Russian military infrastructure and supply chains from strikes by Ukraine. From Ukraine's side, Lifting these restrictions could change tactics, allowing Ukraine to disrupt the logistical and operational structures supporting Russia's military efforts." Such a development is likely to complicate Russia's operational planning and threaten the stability of supply on which Moscow's campaign has relied since 2022. And let me remind you, today President Zelensky announced that there was such a meeting of the military, and some decisions are being prepared together with partners regarding exactly the mirror strikes across the entire territory of Russia in response to what they are doing to our country, shelling it with drones and missiles. At the same time, this week or the next few days could really be crucial, because here the issue of lifting restrictions is being discussed. At the same time, it is being reported that Trump is ready to impose sanctions against Russia this week. Trump is considering the possibility of imposing sanctions against Russia this week, as he is increasingly disappointed by the ongoing attacks on Ukraine and the slow pace of peace negotiations. It is being reported. According to the publication's sources, the restrictions are unlikely to include new banking sanctions. But other options for putting pressure on Putin are being discussed to make him make concessions, including a 30-day ceasefire. However, as the publication writes, Trump may also decide not to impose new sanctions, but instead withdraw from the negotiations. According to people familiar with his thinking, Trump is also tired of the peace talks and is considering the possibility of abandoning them if the last push does not work. At the same time, it is unclear what will happen if the United States withdraws from the peace process and whether Trump will continue to provide military support to Ukraine. As White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the day before, quote, President Trump has made it clear that he wants to see a peace agreement reached through negotiations. President Trump is also wisely keeping all options on the table. Well, as noted, for several weeks, Trump resisted pressure to rein in Putin for refusing to agree to a ceasefire. And many of Ukraine's allies, including Senator Lindsey Graham, have told Trump personally that Putin does not want to negotiate, and that only punishment will force him to engage in any serious talks. And, as officials note, 3 key factors influenced Trump's thinking as to why he began to speak so sharply about Putin and perhaps change his rhetoric. First, his dislike for the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky, who, according to Trump, encourages further conflict by insisting on sanctions. Although it was Zelensky who agreed to a ceasefire. And on Sunday, when he criticized Putin, Trump also criticized Zelensky in a social media post. Trump also believed that additional sanctions against Russia would not limit its ability to wage war, but would hinder efforts to restore economic ties between the United States and Russia. Well, finally, Trump believed that he knew Putin, he always boasted about it, and that the Russian dictator would end the war as a personal favor to Donald Trump. He said, "We're good friends, right?" Well, Putin would kind of say, "All right, Trump is asking, so I'll go ahead and stop the war." However, Putin's unwillingness to give in spoiled Trump's opinion of the Russian dictator, especially after the phone conversation last week, during which Putin refused to sign a ceasefire agreement. Well, here is Lindsey Graham, that very Republican senator, who today warned that the Senate is already prepared to impose sanctions against the Russian Federation that would turn it into a trading island. In a column for Lindsey Graham, he writes that the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan damaged the reputation of the states and provoked aggression around the world. In his opinion, this can be changed by maintaining decisive leadership in the matter of ending Russia's war against Ukraine. Quote, Mr. Trump can restore our reputation and put an end to the bloodshed, but peace requires partners who are willing to achieve it. While Ukraine has made it clear that it is ready for such an end, Russia is coming up with more excuses than the market can bear. Next. Lindsey Graham reminds us that President Donald Trump is waiting for a document from the Kremlin dictator Putin with Moscow's demands for a ceasefire. The further course of Washington depends on this answer. According to him, the Senate is ready for both options. Quote from Lindsey Graham. The bill will put Russia on a trade island by imposing 500% tariffs on any country that buys Moscow's energy resources. The consequences of Russia's barbaric invasion must become a reality for those who support it. If China or India stop buying cheap oil, Putin's war machine will come to a halt. Lindsey Graham says that the bill on draconian sanctions against Russia already has 82 co-authors, and he is now coordinating work on it with the White House. Quote, I hope for the best. But when it comes to the bandit in Moscow, we should all be prepared for him to continue in the same spirit. Let me remind you that Senate Bill SI 1241, known as the Russia Sanctions Act of 2025, was introduced in the United States Senate back on April 1, 2025 by the same Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. This document is aimed at imposing tough sanctions against the Russian Federation. In the event that its government refuses to participate in good faith peace negotiations with Ukraine, violates a concluded peace agreement, or undertakes new military aggression against Ukraine. And among the key provisions of this bill are sanctions against Russian officials, including the freezing of their assets and a ban on entry into the United States. It is also proposed to introduce restrictions against financial institutions and companies connected to the Russian government. In the financial sector, this bill provides for a ban on transactions with Russia for American banks and investors, as well as a ban on the purchase of Russian sovereign debt. And separately, international pressure is provided for. This is the most important thing. Countries that continue to buy Russian oil, uranium, or petroleum products plus gas may face sanctions in the form of increased tariffs on their exports to the United States of America, up to a level of 500%. But this is not an embargo. It's a total ban on trade. Okay? And the key players here are India and China. This is the most important thing. Maybe this will hit them the hardest. But nevertheless, despite such rhetoric, it seems that in the White House they still expect that negotiations might take place. Today, Kit Kellogg, Donald Trump's special representative for Ukraine, stated that Ukraine has already provided the United States with a list of conditions for achieving peace. And now America is waiting for a corresponding memorandum from Russia, about which the Russians were the first to start shouting. Here, to be honest, the Russians are trying to lead the Americans by the nose, and unfortunately they're succeeding. Look, Putin says, I won't agree to a ceasefire for 30 days. Let's meet in Istanbul on the 15th of May. There will be negotiations. He didn't fly there himself. He didn't send anyone adequate there. He sent this Medinsky, who is basically a nobody, just an empty shell who can't make any decisions. And in fact, there weren't really any negotiations. Yes, they took place, but it was at a technical level, which is definitely not the level where decisions can be made. After that, even after these negotiations, the Russians say that they will prepare a memorandum on a ceasefire, meaning a list of our demands. Let Ukraine provide its own list, and based on these lists, we will spend months looking for a compromise. Alright, Ukraine has already submitted its memorandum. The Russians still haven't written anything. So again, it's a situation where they say, let's do this. The Americans say, let's do this. And the Russians aren't doing it. Well, according to Kit Kellogg, as soon as the United States receives this memorandum from the Russian side, it will be possible to organize a meeting between Ukraine and the Russian Federation for peace talks. Kellogg added that such a meeting will likely take place in Geneva, Switzerland. And further, here's a quote from Kit Kellogg regarding, once again, how the Russians are doing everything they can to avoid meaningful negotiations. Quote, we would have liked to hold this meeting in the Vatican, but the Russians did not want to go there. Therefore, Geneva could become the next stop where all three main leaders will meet: Putin, President Zelensky, and President Trump. And they will work all this out and sign some kind of document to put an end to this war. Notice how Kit Kellogg says President Zelensky, President Trump, and Putin. Well, you really shouldn't call this bold creature anything else. Well, moving on. Kellogg added that now it is necessary to keep putting pressure on Russia to force the country to sit down at the negotiating table. According to him, the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin noted during his conversation with Trump that Russia plans to prepare such a memorandum when it is unknown. Nevertheless, as we can see, Washington is at least starting to send such signals that it is ready for something, imposing sanctions, reconsidering military aid to Ukraine in the direction of strengthening it. Still, and this is already at least some kind of shift that gives hope. But here I put an ellipsis. Write your opinion, your conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to leave a like. That's all. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.